2024, an election year like no other. From the candidates to the issues, from voter integrity and analysis, we'll discuss debates, trends, patterns, election laws, and more. This is Vote 2024, Path to the Polls.
If I remember my music, it was The Clash who sang, "Should I Stay or Should I Go?" And with South Carolina in the rearview mirror, it is clear that Donald Trump won, and it was on Nikki Haley's turf. But she says she is going to stay, and she is going to continue to clash with Donald Trump. That's no surprise. So what is the path forward for Governor Haley? She insists she is going to continue to stay on the campaign trail. She has been pretty candid. She called him toxic, asked why military families should trust him. She called his NATO comments bone-chilling. And even though she hasn't won a GOP contest against him, including now in her home state, she says she is going to go the distance. Welcome to Vote 2024, Path to the Polls, joined by my buddy, Rick Mullaney, our News4Jax political analyst and the head of the JU, Jacksonville University Public Policy Institute. Rick, welcome back.
Great to be here, Bruce.
So she remains defiant. Next big test today in Michigan, though it is doubtful she will win. She goes to Super Tuesday, where there are 18 states on the line, actually 17 states, and American Samoa. How far do you think she can go?
Bruce, I think you just outlined it. It's Super Tuesday. She has said publicly, she's announced it, that she's going to go through Super Tuesday, which is a week from today. As you just mentioned, they have all those states on the ballot, about a third of the delegates at stake. Over the next 7 days, you're going to see 21 states. You have Michigan today, some other states, and then, of course, Super Tuesday. The key for her, of course, is funding. Funding always dictates whether you can stay in or not. She does have that funding to stay in, although she's lost some funding. For example, the Koch brothers are no longer supporting her. So she is going to hang in there through Super Tuesday, and then we'll have to see from there. There is really a very limited path, if any path, for Nikki Haley. I think she knows that realistically. I think her donors know that realistically. But as she said after South Carolina, quite frankly, 40% is not a small number. That's a very significant challenge for Donald Trump. But his win in South Carolina, Bruce, we do have to emphasize, was a big win. Did she outperform expectations? Yes. He was favored by 5 touchdowns, and he won by 3 touchdowns. That's still a pretty significant win. So far, advantage Donald Trump.
You know, it's interesting because she actually has more in her war chest than does Donald Trump. But the Koch brothers, as you said, have said we're not going to put any more money in there. They're going to continue to back Nikki Haley. But does the money start to run out? Then where does the funding that had been going to her go? Where do Nikki Haley's loyalties lie after this?
Well, that's a really great question. She's become a little bit more circumspect on the answer to the question, will you support Donald Trump if you lose? I think she's just holding off a little bit. But we'll know about a week from today. After Super Tuesday, the handwriting will clearly be on the wall. Realistically, Donald Trump should wrap up this nomination in March, maybe a couple weeks after Super Tuesday next week. For Nikki Haley, that means will kind of be the end of the road in that funding, and then she'll have to make a decision on the endorsement. I suspect she'll get on board with him. But for Nikki Haley, she's hanging in there. She's been defiant. She didn't perform as well as she wanted in South Carolina, but she's got enough to get to Super Tuesday.
You know, it's interesting. You said she might get on board with him. A lot of people speculate that Tim Scott might be his running mate. Could she potentially be on the ticket?
I think that's highly, highly unlikely. I think Tim Scott is far more likely. Tim Scott, there's a lot to be said for him as a vice presidential candidate. Unlikely for Nikki Haley. I think Tim Scott's clearly on the short list.
You know, it had been said that our governor might be on the short list, but he's getting under his skin right now. In fact, it was said that Donald Trump is not happy with Governor DeSantis because DeSantis is making it clear that he's got his eyes set on 2028.
Yeah, I don't think Donald Trump knows, and his team knows, that he needs to bring everybody together. He needs those, by the way, big issue, he needs those Haley voters. He needs those DeSantis voters for November. And so when he floats a DeSantis, that's a sort of an olive branch to that group. But if you're looking in your crystal ball, which has turned out to be pretty flawed lately, I would not expect Governor DeSantis to be the VP. I would not expect Nikki Haley. I do think Tim Scott is clearly on the short list, as well as some governors from some other states. I'm not so sure how big a difference that makes in the end, but for Donald Trump, he is going to have to find a way to bring this party together, because as long as there's a big part of that Haley vote that is not going to vote for Donald Trump, that's a problem for him. He needs 90% of the Republicans to be on board to be viable come November. He's in the mid to high 80s right now, We'll have to wait and see.
You know, I texted with you yesterday. I said I wasn't sure if I was going to bring something up about Donald Trump's need for voters. Nikki Haley's made it a point. She said, I don't think that he can beat Joe Biden. I mean, that's yet to be seen, and we won't know for sure until November. Donald Trump does need a sector of the electorate, and part of that is the black vote. Because if you look back to 2020, and you know, I discussed this on this program last week. If you look at the black vote in 2020, it is basically what swept Joe Biden and Kamala Harris into office. There's a big question about what's going to happen this year. Some of the comments that Donald Trump has made, it raised eyebrows. He said, look, you know, there are black people that can identify with me, and they're carrying around my mugshot. They can identify with me because, you know, of my criminal history now. I mean, there's a judge says you are guilty of insurrection. There's a court that says you are guilty of fraud. There's a court that says you are guilty of sexual assault. And he says, that's why the black vote can identify with me now. There's also people in the Republican Party, members of the Black Caucus, that are sitting there and saying, you know, Colin Powell and Senator Edward Brooke would be aghast at what's going on. And there are people who wonder how many black American voters could stand behind him as a result of that. Is he going about courting the black vote in the wrong way?
Well, Bruce, that might not have been the way I would recommend for him to go about it, but he has made inroads. Two things can potentially help Donald Trump when it comes to the black vote. One is the dissatisfaction in the African-American community with Joe Biden. And that doesn't mean they're going to vote for Donald Trump, but it means they may stay home. And you have to motivate them to get out, because the black vote is solidly Democratic. There's no doubt about that. The other is that he is making some inroads into the black vote. If he can get to that 20% or 22%, as you pointed out earlier, it is a difference maker, particularly in Michigan. In Michigan is a great example. Michigan is a battleground state that you have to win if you want to be president this year. And that's going to be a big battle between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. So for that African-American vote, certainly Donald Trump has taken a lot of criticism from Nikki Haley and from the left for the comments he's made. He's also had his defenders, but he has made some inroads there. It's an important constituency. It's so interesting, Bruce, when you step back from this. Both Donald Trump and Joe Biden have serious, significant challenges in shoring up a coalition to win. For Donald Trump, what does he do about the black vote? What does he do about those moderates? What does he do about independents? For Joe Biden, it's that challenge with young voters, with black voters, and of course, the Arab American community. So for both, it's going to be a very challenging election. It is the matchup that the majority of the country does not want. Each of them has their weaknesses. It's going to be a race unlike any other.
So the black vote in Michigan is a test for Donald Trump. The Arab American vote is a test for Joe Biden, because you've got a big African American community, or Arab American community in Michigan, especially in Dearborn, in Detroit. And this is really going to be Joe Biden's big test. And you know, I know there's talk of maybe some ground being broken when it comes to what's happening between Hamas and Israel, and maybe there being a ceasefire. Big maybes, not going to happen before this vote in Michigan. So big test for Joe Biden.
Well, today in Michigan, on the Democratic side, keep an eye on it, because on the ballot there will be uncommitted. It's one of the things you can vote for, and some have voted for that in the past. And you've seen some from the left, some progressives, urging Democrats to vote uncommitted. They want to see that. They want to see a protest vote to send a message to Joe Biden not to take them for granted. Remember, Joe Biden won in 2020 by about 150,000 votes in Michigan. When Donald Trump won in 2016, he won by 11,000 votes. There's well over 200,000 Arab Americans in that area, in that Detroit metropolitan area. This is a big deal for Joe Biden. Today in the primary is one thing, it'll be interesting to see, but the bigger test is November. What about Joe Biden and Michigan come November? Two really big challenges. One is the Arab American vote, but the other is those auto workers and the electric vehicles, and how quickly that transition is going to be, and whether they perceive their jobs to be at risk. So Michigan is clearly in play, and Michigan is part of that blue wall for Joe Biden. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. He needs to win those three, but Michigan is really, really key. Donald Trump took it in 2016. He lost it in 2020. It's in play this year.
And the blue wall is important, because you've got to take into account the economy. Joe Biden is very critical of the media. He says, they don't get me, and they don't talk about what the economy is doing. Joe Biden's perception of what the economy is doing and the American public's perception of what the economy is doing are two very different things. I mean, you can look at some of the national numbers and inflation and what's happening with interest rates and things, but the American public is saying, look, you know, grocery prices are 25% higher than what they were before the pandemic. And that's where it's hitting us in the pocketbook. And that's what Joe Biden doesn't seem to be getting. I saw an article just the other day, and people are saying, you know what? We're not buying brand items anymore. We're going with the generics. And that's where, you know, the White House doesn't get it right now.
Bruce, they really don't. This isn't a mystery. It's not confusing. For the American people, they recognize how challenging their lives are when it comes to something like take housing. You're in a house, suppose it was $200,000, now maybe it's worth $300,000. If you wanted to move, you'd be hard pressed to do it because you'd have a higher interest rate if you wanted to go somewhere else. And that, although you have a higher number there, it's a higher number for what you're trying to buy. If you're a young person just coming out of school, housing alone, very difficult for young people to buy a home. Prices are up, interest rates are up. It's just the practical challenge. The inflation factor is a big one. It's a permanent loss of wealth for many. If you're elderly on a fixed income, it's a problem. If you're at the lower end of the economic sphere, it's a problem. And so I think there is this disconnect. You want to talk about the number of jobs that are created or talk about economic growth. That sounds good, but when someone goes to the grocery store and they're taking back half what they used to bring back, or they go to the gas station, or they try to buy a house, they know very, very well that times are different. Plus, there is this sort of insecurity among many people that even if their balance sheet looks a little better, there's this uncertainty about the future. There's this concern about the future. That is the disconnect. And by the way, many are saying this may improve by November. I believe this will still be here coming November because that inflationary factor is a really big one. And the rate of inflation may have been going down and now it's ticking back up. But for most Americans, that inflation is it affects them every day of their lives.
And we're already hearing that when it comes to Social Security, and we know that there are a lot of people who are on fixed incomes, that the Social Security cost of living raise next year is going to be a fraction of it was this go-round. We talk a lot about the fracture within the Republican Party.
Yes.
It's going to be interesting to see what Democrats join Joe Biden on the campaign trail. And from what we're hearing, the Democrats that may join him want something in return, and that's very interesting too.
It is, Bruce. For other Democrats on the campaign trail, they look at Joe Biden, and much of this depends on whether you're in a swing state, whether you're in a blue district or a red district, and how close it is. The majority of Democrats are going to be campaigning with Joe Biden, but some are going to distance themselves from Joe Biden, particularly in those swing districts. And when he does come to campaign with them, they want him to bring with him specifics of what they're doing for their district, what bridges are being built, what infrastructure is being built, what chips are being built. They want to show specific benefits to those districts because there's a big race this November, of course, in Congress, with the House and the Senate. So for some, if you're from a blue state, such as Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, he is certainly all in for Joe Biden. He can do that. But for others, you're seeing Democrats go back and forth as to how they're going to run their campaigns. Some are going to embrace him more fully. Some are going to distance themselves, and some are going to take that position in between. They'll bring in Joe Biden, but they want to talk specifics about what the infrastructure bill has done, what his legislation has done, and how it's benefited their district.
All right, let's jump to Super Tuesday. Caleb, if you could put that graphic up. We've got 875 delegates that are up for grabs in 15 states and American Samoa. So you've got Alabama, Alaska, Arkansas, California, Colorado, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, Vermont, and Virginia. People seem to sit back and say, okay, it's going to be a Trump-Biden matchup unless something dramatic happens. Does it really matter at this point in the American electorate's mind?
As far as Super Tuesday, you mean? As far as what's going to... I think Super Tuesday is just simply going to be Donald Trump getting that much closer to securing the delegates he needs to be the Republican nominee. And most likely by March, maybe after Super Tuesday, a couple weeks or so, he will secure the nomination. 875 delegates at stake. And the rules sort of favor Donald Trump, too. For example, winner take all. In California, Nikki Haley may outperform in California, not enough to win the state, and Donald Trump will take all those delegates. She may perform well in some states, such as Massachusetts, but overall, it's going to be Donald Trump. He's on the way to getting the Republican nomination, and Super Tuesday will get him that much closer to securing the delegates that he needs.
Let me talk about the schism now in the Republican Party. We talked about the fact that there are some Dems that may or may not campaign for Joe Biden. You've got a lot of Republicans who say, okay, we're behind Donald Trump, but there are a host of issues, Russia among them, and the Ukraine, that have people going, you know what? We're not all on board with this. Donald Trump will not come out and say that I am against Russia. I am against what Putin is doing here. He is at the center of this big divide in the Republican Party. Could that prove dangerous?
Well, Bruce, clearly the Republican Party is divided and fractured on some big policy issues. Number one is Ukraine. In fact, if you were to say what is the number one contrast between Nikki Haley and Donald Trump when it comes to policy, Ukraine is what comes to mind. She is in favor of supporting Ukraine. She's been very strong in her comments about Putin and about his aggressiveness with Ukraine and taking over that territory and the possibility that he's not stopping there. And this could invoke, of course, NATO and Article 5 if he were to go further. Donald Trump has been more from that isolationist wing, holding off on Ukraine. And that is a real fracture in the Republican Party. There are other areas where the party is fractured, such as on Social Security, where Nikki Haley favors entitlement reform and starting with younger people as to when they retire. On abortion, it's a challenge for the Republican Party. By the way, a big challenge. I think the abortion issue come November is going to be big, just like it was in 2022. There is this fracture, but maybe the biggest fracture is this sort of populist trend in the Republican Party versus the more traditional Republicans. And Donald Trump is the leader of that populism. He's the leader of that movement in Ukraine, that more isolationist view. And so we're going to have to wait and see. But Donald Trump, after his victory in South Carolina, said he's never seen the party more united. Not so sure that I share that view. 40% of that South Carolina electorate went with Nikki Haley. There are fractures on policy issues. There are fractures on style. So the Republican Party, like the Democratic Party, has its challenges in trying to be cohesive. Clearly it does.
What does it do to the worldview of the United States, especially as a world power, when you have Donald Trump coming out and saying, you know what, when it comes to NATO, let Russia do what they want to these countries that don't pay their bill?
Well, you know, Republicans have come to his defense, saying that he was simply trying to negotiate. That's his way of leveraging those NATO countries into anteing up to paying more, and that they did pay more during his term. Others would argue that that's a high price to pay if you're emboldening Putin, if you're going to just try, if that's your purpose, is to simply get those NATO countries to pay more, which is part of the solution for Ukraine, and some of those countries are stepping up with Ukraine. So that comments regarding NATO, and if they don't ante up, he would not defend them if they were invaded by Russia, and he would encourage Russia to do what they wanted, have been sharply criticized. Others have said it's a bargaining tactic that he often uses. If it is a bargaining tactic, kind of a challenging one, really.
I would argue that Putin is already emboldened by what's going on in the United States. I mean, there's a report out, unsubstantiated at this point, that there was a plan on the table, a deal on the table, to include Navalny, who died mysteriously. There are some who say that Putin did him in, to bring him and 2 other Americans who have been held wrongfully in Russian prisons in exchange for a Russian hitman. Was this perhaps undermined by some of the rhetoric that is being bandied about carelessly out there?
Well, Bruce, I don't think there's any doubt that Navalny was done in by Putin. And we've seen this time after time with Putin. We should be very clear-eyed when it comes to Putin.
And Trump has had nothing to say about this. Well, I shouldn't say ironically, I'm not surprised.
Very, very quiet on that issue. And this does represent a fracture in the Republican Party, sort of those Reagan Republicans, more traditional in the sense of strong national defense, limited spending, smaller government. They are the minority of the Republican Party today. And particularly as it relates to Ukraine, it relates to Putin, it represents a shift. We haven't landed yet as to how this plays out, but it does represent one of the more remarkable changes in the Republican Party.
All right, let me get on to another topic. Supreme Court conservatives planning to rewrite the rule book in the way that Washington governs our lives. So this all goes back to what they call the Chevron Doctrine. And if the Supreme Court rules the way a lot of people think, it means that Congress and the president wouldn't have the play that they have right now. Let's start it with what's at stake here.
Well, let's back up a little bit. Back in 1984, 40 years ago, the Supreme Court came out with a case called Chevron, in which they basically held that if Congress passes a statute delegating authority to a federal agency, if that statute is vague or ambiguous, then they would defer to the federal agency as long as it was reasonable. And that's been in place for a long time. And interestingly enough, Justice Scalia was one of the people who was supportive of the Chevron Doctrine. Now, picture what that means, however. That very much empowers federal agencies, whether it's the EPA, whether it's the SEC, whether it's the Food and Drug Administration, whether you're talking communications, whether you're talking the environment, it is a really big deal in terms of what it means for those agencies. Over the last 4 decades, with those agencies making even stronger and pushing the limits of that interpretation, there's been a pushback the other way that suggests that the court should have a bigger role. It's the court's job to say what the law is. It's not the agency's job. And so what you're seeing, and there's been a couple cases before the Supreme Court, oral arguments were actually in January, in which the Chevron Doctrine is being called into question. And you do have a divide. The more conservative judges are starting to question Chevron. The more liberal judges are more supportive of Chevron. And what is at stake is those federal agencies and how much discretion and how much authority they're going to have in rulemaking. Now, this may seem like some esoteric conversation. And so what does all that mean to me? It means a lot to everybody because the rules that are being promulgated by those federal agencies affect all of our lives. As an interesting note, Bruce, in Florida and in several states, they've pushed back against this doctrine. And in 2018, Florida adopted a Florida constitutional amendment that prohibited the courts from deferring to state agencies when it comes to the interpretation of these regulations. So this is an area in which there is a disagreement among scholars and among the jurists, and likely you could see a change here.
Would this be a dream come true for the far right?
Well, I think you're going to see it modified. How far it's modified, I don't know. And also, you have to be careful what you pray for, as in so many things, as to what does this really mean. Congress, of course, can always clarify by passing a statute that provides clarity as to what they want to do. But as we've witnessed, it is so hard to get anything through Congress, for Congress to do anything, that many are concerned about that.
Well, we got to do nothing Congress right now, so.
Really, really tough to get anything through the Congress. So what this does mean is it does mean you may see in the future greater challenges to rulemaking and a more active court, and the court being the arbiter of what's reasonable, of what the law really is when Congress passes a statute delegating authority to those federal agencies. Like I said, this seems kind of wonky and esoteric, but it affects everybody in their everyday lives. Everything from how the JEA is regulated in the environmental side, to the Food and Drug Administration, to communications, you name it. This is a really big issue, and the odds appear to favor that the Supreme Court is going to modify that doctrine, giving less discretion to those federal agencies, and the courts are going to take a more active role in determining what Congress means.
All right, so this could create more challenges to federal regulations. I know Justice Kagan has been very critical, scathingly critical of what she thinks the court's going to do.
Justice Kagan and the liberal part of the court comes down on the side of that the federal agencies have greater subject matter expertise. They're the ones who are closer to it. They are far better positioned, she argues, to make these determinations than a court that lacks this expertise. And therefore, what you've seen is the more liberal part of the court, all three of the justices, have really appear to be, from oral argument, more supportive of the Chevron Doctrine. The pushback comes from, for example, Justice Kavanaugh, who says that one of the problems with this is that every time a new administration comes in, they change the regulations, and they change what the law is, because from administration to administration, it goes back and forth. So there appears to be a divide on the court, just as there's a divide elsewhere on the Chevron Doctrine and what should be the scope and the authority of rulemaking in the federal agencies.
All right, let me get back to something about what happens when we go to the polls. A lot of the focus, the majority of the focus seems to be on the presidential election, but there's something that they call down ballot voting, and it has nothing to do with the presidential election. There are votes that are happening elsewhere around the country that really play to balance of power in Congress. And we talk about this do-nothing Congress right now, and some of those elections could have a very profound impact on what happens on Capitol Hill.
Bruce, there's no doubt about that. You're highlighting one of the big issues that people aren't really talking about for November, and that is the balance of power in Congress. And that's going to be affected by Joe Biden at the top of his ticket and Donald Trump at the head of his ticket. And what we're really talking about, of course, in large measure, is the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. In the Senate, the GOP has an advantage on the map this time. So there's a little bit of an edge to the Republican Party when it comes to the Senate because of the map. In the House, it's razor thin for the Republicans, and that is clearly in play and probably an edge to the Democrats. What does this mean as a practical matter? It means as a practical matter, are you going to be able to pass immigration reform? What is your tax policy going to be? What legislation are you going to have in appropriations? Are you going to be able to avoid a government shutdown? It is fundamentally important, of course, for whoever's in the White House come next January, whether it's, let's say, Joe Biden or whether it's Donald Trump, that when they go to Congress, are they going to be able to get their agenda through? And that relates to what you're just talking about. What happens down ballot? And I expect that to be a big battle. And also, and it's not really a sleeper issue, Bruce, but I think one of the big issues, everyone's going to say immigration is top of mind, the economy and inflation is top of mind. Of course they are. But the abortion issue will be a really big deal in those midterm elections. They were in 2022, and I expect that they will be in 2024.
And the reality is that you have a lot of members of the House, basically Republicans, and I'm not saying this because there is any bias, it is just a fact, a lot of Republican members of the House who are saying, you know what, I'm done. I'm retiring because I'm tired of the BS that goes on because we can't get anything done.
It's a challenge anymore throughout Congress with a lot of members of Congress, this sort of stalemate, this paralysis that's going on. You can see it right now in whether or not you can even get certain legislation to have a vote on in the House. There is that frustration. I think that frustration exists on the Republican and the Democratic side. I'm hopeful, but I don't necessarily think it's going to happen. I'm hopeful we'll see a shift in that. For the sake of the country, we need to, because right now that stalemate, that paralysis is really hurting our ability on lots of fronts, whether it's the border, whether it's on the economy, whatever, lots of issues, Bruce.
And the other problem is that you've got politicians who have their personal agendas and their personal futures that they put before the American agenda. I will say that I think that the Speaker of the House doesn't put things forth because he's worried that his fate will be that of Kevin McCarthy if he does certain things, make certain chess moves.
Bruce, unfortunately, and I wouldn't limit this to the Speaker, unfortunately, and I know this sounds really critical, but I think the norm anymore for Republicans and Democrats, and this is a shame that this is the norm, it is about self-interest and staying in power more so than maybe what's best for the country. And you can see that on the Republican and the Democratic side. It's about winning. It's about power. It's about self-interest. And that is really, really unfortunate. Every now and then, you'll see someone step up without regard to self-interest, who's willing to do something that may hurt them politically, but that is a rarity, and that's why we appreciate it so much. This is one of the great challenges that the country faces today.
I think I've said this before on this program. There were politicians back in the day who knew when to hold them, knew when to fold them. I don't think they exist, the majority of them today. Rick, always a pleasure. Thanks for being here. Want to remind you that if you've enjoyed this program, want to watch it again, or want to tell somebody about it, it's available on demand at your convenience on News4Jax, the YouTube channel, news4jax.com, and News4Jax Plus. Have a great day. We appreciate you.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.